Let me tell you something about snow. There's the kind of snow that falls gentle and quiet on a Saturday morning, the kind you see in Christmas card pictures, soft and fluffy and perfect. And then there's the kind of snow that hits Pinecrest Estates in the middle of January, the kind that dumps 14 inches overnight, buries your car up to the door handles, turns every road into a skating rink, and basically dares you to try to live a normal life. That second kind is what we got on the morning of January 14th, and it kicked off what I can only describe as the most satisfying neighborhood drama I have ever personally witnessed. And trust me, I've been living in Pinecrest Estates for 6 years, so the bar for drama was already pretty high. My name is Doug Hoffman. I'm 41 years old, I work remotely as a network engineer, and I own a fairly modest 3-bedroom house on Clearwater Lane in Pinecrest Estates. It's a nice neighborhood, genuinely nice, with mature trees, decent neighbors, and a homeowners association that had somehow, over the course of about 3 years, been completely hijacked by one woman. That woman was Wanda Ellsworth. Wanda lived 4 houses down from me on the same street. She was in her mid-50s, perpetually bundled in a fleece vest regardless of the season, and she had appointed herself the moral authority of our entire subdivision. She was on the HOA board, held the position of Community Standards Chair, a title she had essentially created for herself, and crammed into the bylaws through a series of board meetings that most residents didn't even know were happening. Wanda had a gift for scheduling important votes on Tuesday afternoons in February, when sensible people had other things to do. Over the years, Wanda had fined people for holiday decorations left up past her personally preferred deadline, cited a guy 3 streets over for having a basketball hoop that was 2 inches too tall according to a measurement. She took herself with a tape measure she brought in her fanny pack, and once tried to get a family removed from the neighborhood pool for what she described as excessive splashing. She collected HOA fines the way some people collect stamps, and rumor had it that the accounting for where those fines actually went was, let's say, creative. I had managed to stay mostly under her radar. I kept my lawn in shape, my house exterior clean, my fence in good repair. I didn't give her much to work with, but the January blizzard was about to change all of that, and honestly, looking back, I'm grateful it did, because what came out of it was long overdue. So, the snow. 14 inches overnight, temperature sitting at about 12 degrees Fahrenheit by 6 in the morning, wind chill making it feel closer to 0. I woke up early, around 5:30, because I could hear the wind still howling, and I knew from experience that the longer you wait to clear heavy snow like that, the more it compacts and the harder it gets. Plus, I was expecting a grocery delivery later in the morning, and there was no way a delivery driver was going to navigate my driveway if I didn't get it cleared. I suited up. Long underwear, thick wool socks, insulated pants, my heavy parka that I bought specifically for weather like this, gloves, face mask, the whole setup. I went to my garage, checked the gas on my snow blower, a powerful 2-stage machine I bought 2 winters ago after throwing my back out shoveling, and I got to work on my own driveway first. Now I want to be clear about timing here because it matters. It was 6:15 in the morning when I fired up the snow blower. Not 5 in the morning, not 4. 6:15 on a weekday, after 14 inches of snow had shut down half the city. The municipal snow plows had already been running since 3 in the morning. I could hear them on the main road. My next-door neighbor Phil had already been out shoveling for 20 minutes before I even started. The sound of snow removal equipment in the morning after a major storm is, in most reasonable interpretations of the world, expected. My snow blower is loud, I'll acknowledge that. It's a workhorse machine, the kind with a serious engine, and it throws snow a good 20 feet. But it's not, by any objective measure, an unreasonable sound to encounter at 6:15 in the morning in the middle of winter after a record snowfall. I cleared my driveway in about 15 minutes, got my walkway done, and then I made a decision that I'm genuinely proud of. I decided to keep going. Here's some context. My immediate neighbors on either side were Phil Marcetti and the Delgado family. Phil was a retired firefighter in his late 60s with a bad knee that had been acting up all winter. The Delgados had 3 kids under 10 and 2 full-time working parents who had already called in a snow day, but still needed to get the cars out eventually. I had the fuel, I had the machine, I had the time, and the cold didn't bother me that much. So I cleared Phil's driveway, then swung around to the Delgados. Took me maybe another 30 minutes combined. While I was finishing up at the Delgados, Maria Delgado came to the door in her robe and waved at me through the storm door with the most grateful look on her face, giving me a big thumbs up. Phil had already texted me a string of thank you emojis that nearly filled my entire notification screen. It felt good. It felt like what neighbors are actually supposed to do for each other. Then I moved to the next house, and then the one after that, and then the one after that. By 7:30, I had cleared 6 driveways on Clearwater Lane. I was in a rhythm, I had fuel to spare, and the whole thing had turned into this weirdly meditative experience where it was just me and the machine, and the satisfaction of watching a buried driveway transform into a clean, usable surface. The cold had stopped bothering me. I was warm from the exertion, focused, happy even. And that was when I heard the front door of 412 Clearwater Lane fly open. 412 Clearwater Lane was Wanda Ellsworth's house. She came out onto her front porch wrapped in a bathrobe the color of old mustard, her hair in some kind of clip on top of her head, her face contorted into an expression of absolute outrage. She was wearing slippers, in 12-degree weather with 14 inches of snow on the ground. The woman marched to the edge of her porch, pointed her finger at me like she was casting a spell, and yelled something I couldn't hear over the engine noise. I cut the engine. The silence that followed was almost startling. I said, Wanda announced, loud enough for the whole street to hear, that you have been running that machine for over an hour and it is 7:30 in the morning and you have been disturbing this entire neighborhood's peace. I pulled down my face mask and looked at her. Wanda, it's 7:30 in the morning after 14 inches of snow. I don't care how much snow there is, Douglas, she said. She always called me Douglas. I hated it. There are noise ordinances in this neighborhood. There are standards. You don't just go running industrial machinery at the crack of dawn and disturb everyone's sleep. It's 7:30, I said again. People are trying to sleep. Wanda, the city plow has been running on the main road since 3 in the morning. That is a city vehicle performing essential services. You are a private citizen with a hobby machine making a racket for your own amusement. I want you to appreciate that she called my snow blower a hobby machine. My 2-stage, 24-inch clearing 208cc engine snow blower, a hobby machine. I looked at her for a second, then I looked at my snow blower. Then I looked at the beautifully cleared driveways stretching down the block behind me. Then I looked at Wanda's driveway, which was buried under 14 inches of packed snow that the overnight wind had swept into a drift along the right side, making it closer to 18 inches in that corner. Then I looked back at Wanda. Okay, I said. I pulled my face mask back up, reached for the ignition cord, and started the snow blower back up. Wanda's expression did something interesting. It went from furious to confused in about half a second, because she had expected me to either argue with her or apologize and go inside. She had not expected me to simply nod and keep going. She stood there on her porch, slippered feet probably going numb by the second, watching as I turned the machine around, and I drove it straight past her driveway. I went to the next house down, which belonged to an older couple named the Harpers. George Harper was 82 years old and used a walker. His wife Alina was 78 and had been having some health issues that past fall. They had no business trying to clear 14 inches of snow, and I was absolutely going to take care of their driveway before I went back inside. I fired up the machine and started on their driveway. I could feel Wanda watching me from her porch the whole time. I didn't look back. I just worked. By the time I finished the Harpers' driveway and their front walkway all the way to their door, George Harper had appeared at his front window and was waving at me with both hands. I gave him a thumbs up. Eleanor came to the door and called out something that sounded like, "God bless you, Doug," which was genuinely touching. I started packing up. I was out of immediate neighbors who needed help, and I had been out in the cold for nearly 2 hours at that point. I turned the machine toward my own driveway and walked it home, glancing at Wanda's driveway as I passed. It was still buried. Wanda was still on her porch, now clearly freezing, her arms crossed tight over her robe, her slippered feet doing a little involuntary shuffle against the cold. Our eyes met. "Your driveway was next on my route," I said pleasantly, "but since you had concerns about the machine, I figured I'd respect your peace and quiet." I don't think I have ever seen a human face do what Wanda Ellsworth's face did in that moment. It was like watching someone try to load too many programs on an old computer. You could almost see the spinning wheel. I went inside, made coffee, and sat by my front window like the absolute petty champion that I am. By 9 in the morning, Wanda was out in her driveway with a snow shovel, still in her bathrobe but now with boots on, trying to excavate her car. She was making slow, angry progress. By 9:30 she had cleared maybe a third of it and was visibly exhausted. By 10 o'clock she had gone back inside and her car stayed buried in her driveway for the rest of that day. That should have been the end of it. A funny story to tell over beers. Minor neighborhood drama, karma delivered, case closed. But Wanda Ellsworth was not the kind of person who let things go. 2 days after the snowstorm, I received an official HOA notice in my mailbox. It was printed on HOA letterhead, complete with the Pinecrest Estates logo, a little pine tree that always looked slightly off-center to me. The notice informed me that I had been cited for violation of HOA Community Standards Rule 7.4, which pertained to excessive noise generation during restricted residential hours, and that I was being assessed a fine of $150. The notice was signed by Wanda Ellsworth, Community Standards Chair. I read it twice. I made another cup of coffee. I sat down at my kitchen table, which also functioned as my work desk, and I opened my laptop. Here is a thing about me that Wanda did not know. Before I got into network engineering, I spent 3 years working as a paralegal at a firm that specialized in property and homeowner disputes. I'm not a lawyer. I want to be clear about that. But I know how to read a legal document. I know how to research HOA law, and I know what HOAs can and cannot actually do. I pulled up the full Pinecrest Estates HOA governing documents, which were available online through the county's property records portal. I found Rule 7.4. I read it very carefully. Rule 7.4 stated that residents were prohibited from operating power tools, landscaping equipment, or similar machinery before 7 a.m. or after 9 p.m. on weekdays and before 8 a.m. or after 8 p.m. on weekends. It was a weekday. I had started my snow blower at 6:15, which was technically before 7. I'll give Wanda this. She had done her homework, sort of. But here's what she missed. 2 things, actually. First, there was an exception clause at the bottom of Rule 7.4, which read, "Emergency conditions, including but not limited to severe weather events, public safety concerns, or municipal snow emergency declarations, shall exempt residents from the restrictions of this rule as deemed necessary." The city had, in fact, issued a snow emergency declaration at 2 in the morning on the day of the storm. I found the city's official announcement in about 45 seconds of searching. That declaration was still in effect when I started my snow blower. Second, and this was the one that really made me smile, even setting aside the exception clause, the HOA's ability to levy noise-related fines was explicitly limited by a state statute that had been updated 2 years ago, which required that HOA noise citations be supported by a documented noise level measurement taken by a certified individual or device. Not "my neighbor woke me up with his machine." An actual documented measurement. Wanda had provided no such documentation. The fine was, from a legal standpoint, almost certainly unenforceable. I didn't write back immediately. I let it sit for a day. I wanted to think about how I wanted to handle this, because I had a few different options and I wanted to pick the most effective one. Meanwhile, the neighborhood had been talking. Word travels fast on a residential street, especially in winter when people are stuck inside and texting each other. Phil Marcetti had told several people about what I'd done, clearing driveways for the elderly and the busy families, spending 2 hours in 12-degree weather helping out. The Harpers had apparently called 3 different neighbors to tell them about it. Maria Delgado had posted in the neighborhood Facebook group a glowing description of what I'd done, complete with a photo she'd taken from her window of me working on the Harpers' walkway. The post had 73 comments by that evening. Every single one was positive, either thanking me directly or expressing general appreciation for the kind of neighborly behavior that people said they wished they saw more of in the community. And then, right there in the comments, someone posted a photo of the HOA notice I'd been sent. I don't know who had seen it or how they got a copy of it. I suspected it might have been Phil because he had stopped by my house that afternoon, but whoever it was, the photo was there, and people were not happy. The comments shifted. People started talking about other fines they'd received. Someone brought up the basketball hoop incident. Someone else mentioned that they'd been fined for having a flag holder that was allegedly not the right dimensions, a fine they'd paid because they didn't know they could push back. Another person mentioned that they'd been assessed a fee for a landscaping violation that turned out to be a bush that had grown 2 inches taller than the HOA's maximum allowable hedge height, a violation that Wanda had personally measured with, yes, the tape measure from her fanny pack. The conversation was getting very lively. I watched all of this from the warmth of my living room, wrapped in a blanket with a mug of hot cocoa, and I made notes. Names, violation types, amounts paid, dates. I was building something. I wasn't sure yet exactly what shape it would take, but I was building it. The next morning I wrote my formal response to the HOA fine. I kept it very professional and very specific. I cited the snow emergency declaration by date and official city reference number. I cited Rule 7.4's exception clause verbatim. I cited the state statute regarding documented noise level measurement requirements. I politely noted that based on these facts, the fine appeared to be improperly issued and potentially unenforceable, and I requested that it be formally withdrawn within 10 business days, after which I would consider other avenues for addressing the matter. I mailed a physical copy to the HOA's official mailing address. I also emailed it to the full HOA board, whose email addresses were listed on the community website. I CC'd myself and saved everything. Then I waited. 3 days went by. The temperature dropped again, this time down to single digits overnight, and a second, smaller snowstorm came through and added another 4 inches on top of everything. I cleared my own driveway, and because I genuinely could not help myself, I cleared Phil's and the Delgados and the Harpers again. I did not offer to clear Wanda's. On the 4th day, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. It was a man named Robert Finch, who introduced himself as the HOA board president. I'd seen his name on documents, but we'd never spoken directly. He sounded uncomfortable in the way that people sound when they know they're in a bad position, but are trying to project authority anyway. He told me that the board had reviewed my response to the citation. He said there were differing interpretations of the exception clause in Rule 7.4. He said the board felt that the noise issue was still a valid community concern regardless of the snow emergency declaration. He said the fine stood. I took notes during the call. At the end, I asked him to confirm that decision in writing by email to the address I had already used for the board. He agreed, a little reluctantly. He sent the email that evening. The fine was confirmed as valid and payable within 30 days, or additional late fees would begin to accrue. I read the email, set my laptop aside, and stared at my ceiling for a while. Okay, I thought. Okay then. I reached out to 7 of the neighbors who had commented on the Facebook post about the fines they'd received. I asked them if they'd be willing to share their documentation, violation notices, receipts of fines paid, any correspondence with the HOA. Every single one of them said yes. What I received over the next 3 days was genuinely eye-opening. 8 neighbors, counting myself, had received fines that ranged from questionable to outright fabricated. One family, the Newyans on Birchwood Court, had been fined $300 for a driveway surface violation that, as far as anyone could tell, amounted to the fact that their concrete driveway had natural weathering patterns that Wanda had decided resembled unapproved decorative scoring. The Newyans had paid the fine because the notice had threatened legal action and they were nervous. Another neighbor, a single mom named Carol Whitfield, had been fined twice in the same year for the same claimed violation, a flower bed that allegedly exceeded the permitted height along the front property line, and when she'd measured the bed herself, it was exactly at the limit, not over. She'd paid both fines. The total amount collected across these 8 violations was over $1,400, and when I started looking at the HOA's published financial records, which they were required to provide to residents upon request under state law, and which I had to request 3 times before they sent them, something interesting emerged. The fines collected didn't neatly show up in the categories where they were supposed to go. The HOA collected funds for common area maintenance, insurance reserves, and administrative costs. Fine revenue was supposed to supplement the maintenance fund, but the numbers weren't adding up. There was a gap, not enormous, but consistent, between the fines documented on individual violation notices and what appeared in the general fund. Now, I want to be careful here. I am not a forensic accountant. I could have been reading the documents wrong. The discrepancy could have had an innocent explanation, but the pattern across multiple years was concerning enough that I thought it was worth getting a professional opinion. I reached out to a woman named Sandra Krebs who lived in a different part of the development and worked as a CPA. Sandra was not someone I knew well, but she'd been one of the people who commented on the Facebook post, expressing frustration about HOA transparency. I asked if she'd be willing to take a look at the financial documents. She said absolutely, send them over. Sandra called me 4 days later, and her voice had that very particular tone of someone who has found something and is being careful about how they say it. "Doug," she said, "I'm not ready to say definitively what's happening here without a proper audit, but I will say that the line between sloppy bookkeeping and misappropriation of funds is a lot thinner than it should be in these records. There are fine revenues collected that appear to have been deposited, but then moved in a way that doesn't correspond to any documented expense. I'd want an auditor to look at this. Misappropriation of funds, that's a crime. That's not just the HOA is annoying and overreaching. That's actual financial misconduct. I called a lawyer. His name was Kevin Doyle, and he'd been recommended by Phil Marcetti, who had used him for a property boundary dispute a few years earlier. Kevin was a real estate and property attorney who had dealt with HOA cases before. I explained the situation, the improperly levied fines, the financial discrepancy, the documents we'd collected, Sandra's assessment. Kevin was quiet for a moment after I finished. Then he said, "I want to see all of it, every document, and I want to be involved before you do anything else." I sent him everything that day. While Kevin was reviewing, life in the neighborhood went on. The cold snap that had hit in mid-January was turning into one of the longest stretches of below-freezing temperatures in years. There were frozen pipe incidents all over the area, a propane shortage that was hitting some of the older homes that didn't have natural gas, and ice-related car accidents blocking 2 of the main roads into the development for most of a Tuesday morning. People were stressed and irritable and dealing with genuinely difficult winter conditions. Wanda, apparently sensing that she was losing the public relations battle in the neighborhood, made a move that in retrospect was spectacularly ill-advised. She posted in the neighborhood Facebook group herself. The post was long and self-righteous, and essentially argued that the HOA's Community Standards Program was protecting property values and ensuring that Pinecrest Estates remained a desirable community, and that residents who were critical of necessary enforcement actions were undermining the community's long-term well-being. She mentioned, without naming me, that recent complaints about enforcement were being driven by one resident who had chosen to prioritize his own convenience over the community's established rules. The comments on that post were something to behold. Phil Marcetti wrote, with the measured fury of a retired firefighter who knows exactly how to make a point without losing his cool, that the unnamed resident in question had spent 2 hours in 12°, whether clearing the driveways of elderly and young family neighbors out of simple human kindness, and that if the HOA's definition of community well-being didn't include that kind of neighborly action, then the HOA had lost the plot entirely. Maria Delgado wrote that her family had been directly helped by the unnamed resident, and that she stood by her original post completely. Alina Harper wrote, with what I can only imagine was great dignity, that at 82 and 78 years old, she and George might have had a very difficult couple of days without their neighbor's help, and that the idea of him being fined for that help struck her as deeply wrong. Then Carol Whitfield weighed in and mentioned her double fine, and the Nuyens weighed in and mentioned their driveway violation fine. And then 4 or 5 other people started talking about their own experiences with fines and citations that felt arbitrary or unfair. The post became a wall of community grievance that Wanda had inadvertently created a platform for. Wanda deleted the post. But by that point, someone had screenshotted the whole thing, comments and all. Because of course they had. Kevin called me the following Monday. He said he had reviewed everything, and he was prepared to send a formal legal letter to the HOA board on my behalf, demanding the withdrawal of the fine, a full accounting of all fine revenues collected over the past 3 years, and an independent financial audit of the HOA's books. He also said that based on what Sandra Krebs had observed, there was a credible enough basis to recommend that residents with paid fines file complaints with the state's HOA regulatory office, which had oversight authority over homeowners associations in our state. And Doug, he said, if the financial records show what Sandra thinks they might show, we're potentially looking at a criminal referral. I want you to be prepared for that possibility. I said I was prepared. Kevin sent the letter to the HOA board that afternoon, certified mail, with copies emailed to every board member. The reaction was fast and chaotic. Robert Finch called me the next morning, much less composed than he'd been on our first call. He said the board was taking the matter seriously, and that they were consulting with their own legal counsel. He asked if there was any way to resolve this quietly. I told him that the conditions for resolution were clearly stated in Kevin's letter, and that I would leave the response to my attorney. Meanwhile, Sandra had connected with a state-certified auditor she knew professionally, a woman named Patricia Choi, who agreed to take on a preliminary review of the HOA financials. Patricia was thorough and fast. Within 10 days, she came back with a preliminary finding that was alarming. Across 3 years of records, there were approximately $8,400 in fine revenues that could not be traced to any documented HOA expense or reserve contribution. The money had passed through the HOA's operating account and then effectively vanished. Patricia's word for what she was seeing, carefully framed as a preliminary assessment, was embezzlement. Kevin filed a report with the state HOA regulatory office. He also contacted the local police department's financial crimes unit and provided them with the documentation. The regulatory office opened a formal investigation within a week. The police took a little longer because these things move at their own pace, but they got there. In the meantime, Kevin had also filed a motion in county civil court on behalf of myself and the 7 other neighbors who had paid questionable fines, seeking return of those fines plus damages. The total amount sought was a little over $6,000 once you factored in legal costs. Now here is where I have to give you the full picture of what was happening at Wanda's house during all of this, because I think it matters. Wanda's car sat in her snow-packed driveway for 4 days after the initial storm before she managed to fully clear it. During that time, she also ran out of propane. Her house used a propane heating system, one of the older homes in the development, and apparently she hadn't checked her tank level before the storm and hadn't been able to get a delivery truck down her partially blocked street easily. She spent 2 cold nights with space heaters before the propane company managed to navigate the roads and refill her tank. I know this not because I was keeping tabs on her, but because she had complained loudly about it to at least 3 neighbors, apparently believing that the HOA should be doing something about propane delivery access on private residential streets, which was not really how any of that worked. I want to be clear. I did not feel good about Wanda being cold. I'm not that person. If she had knocked on my door during those 2 nights, I would have offered her a warm place to sit and a hot meal, no question. The snow doesn't pick sides, and the cold is the cold. But Wanda did not knock on anyone's door. She managed on her own and she complained loudly, and that was her choice. The HOA board held an emergency meeting in late January. Kevin attended on my behalf. There were also 4 other residents who came, including Phil, Sandra, and Carol Whitfield. The meeting was, by all accounts, tense and uncomfortable for the board members who had signed off on enforcement actions that were now under legal and regulatory scrutiny. Robert Finch spent most of the meeting looking at the table in front of him. 2 other board members had clearly lawyered up and said very little. Wanda was there, and she was, for possibly the first time in her HOA career, quiet. The board voted at that meeting to withdraw my fine. They also voted to freeze all pending enforcement actions pending the outcome of the regulatory investigation. It wasn't everything, but it was a start. The police investigation moved forward through February. Patricia Choi's preliminary audit was provided to them, along with the HOA's banking records that the regulatory office had subpoenaed. The picture that emerged was not subtle. Over 3 years, Wanda Ellsworth, as Community Standards Chair, had been the primary person handling the collection and recording of HOA fines. The fines were collected, sometimes in cash from residents who didn't know better, and the documentation was inconsistent enough that a portion of the money was never formally deposited into the HOA account at all. The total confirmed missing was $8,400, though investigators suspected the actual number might be higher for years where records were particularly patchy. In early March, on a gray, sleety Wednesday morning when the last of the winter's snow was finally starting to give way to mud, and the first tentative signs of something that might eventually become spring, 2 police officers came to 412 Clearwater Lane. I heard about it from Phil, who saw the patrol car from his window. I didn't watch. I wasn't interested in watching someone be arrested, but I'll tell you what Phil told me, that Wanda came out of her house in her coat and scarf, her face tight and pale, and that she was calm in a way that suggested she had been expecting this for a while and had decided to hold whatever composure she had left. They put her in the patrol car and drove away, and the street was quiet. Wanda was charged with misappropriation of fiduciary funds, a felony under state law, and with 2 counts of fraudulent exercise of authority related to fines that were improperly levied without proper documentation or legal basis. The charges were serious enough that she was looking at real consequences if convicted. She hired a private attorney. There were proceedings over the following months that I won't walk you through in complete detail because, honestly, watching the legal process move at its natural speed is about as exciting as watching ice melt, and we'd had enough ice for one winter. What I'll tell you is that by summer, Wanda had agreed to a plea deal that included full restitution of the $8,400, community service, and a period of supervised probation. She was not required to go to prison under the terms of the plea, but she was permanently barred from serving on any HOA board in the state, a condition that I personally found more satisfying than almost anything else about the outcome. The civil case settled separately. All 8 of us who had paid improper fines received full refunds, plus a small additional amount for legal costs. The total paid out by the HOA's insurance carrier, which covered board member liability up to a certain amount, was $7,200. Robert Finch and the other board members who had signed off on enforcement actions without proper oversight were not criminally charged, but they all resigned from the board before spring arrived. Now here's the part that actually made me feel the best about all of it, better than the legal outcome, better than the fine being withdrawn, better even than the look on Wanda's face when I drove the snow blower past her driveway. In April, the residents of Pinecrest Estates held a special election for a new HOA board. There was genuine community engagement in a way there hadn't been in years. People actually showed up. The candidates who ran were neighbors who had proven themselves through the winter in concrete ways. Phil Marcetti ran and was elected president. Sandra Krebs became treasurer, which honestly was the most sensible thing this HOA had done in years. Maria Delgado joined as secretary. A quiet retired teacher named Howard Bellamy from the far end of the development joined as an at-large member. Their first act as a board was to conduct a full review of the HOA's governing documents with Kevin Doyle's assistance, cleaning up ambiguous language, closing loopholes that had allowed community standards enforcement to be exercised without oversight, and establishing a clear appeals process for any future fines. Their second act was to eliminate the community standards chair position entirely. They also established what they called the Neighbor Assistance Fund, a modest reserve within the HOA budget, specifically designated for things like helping elderly residents with snow removal and similar community support efforts. It wasn't a huge pot of money, but it was something, a formal recognition that a community's actual standards have more to do with how people treat each other in 12-degree weather than whether somebody's hedge is 2 inches too tall. Now I want to go back to something, because I think it deserves a little more attention. I've been telling this story in a pretty linear way, and I've focused a lot on the legal and financial side of things because that's where the real accountability happened. But I think the more important thread running through all of this is something simpler than embezzlement charges and civil litigation. When I started that snow blower at 6:15 in the morning on January 14th, I wasn't thinking about strategy. I wasn't thinking about Wanda or the HOA or any of it. I was thinking about my elderly neighbors who couldn't clear their driveways, and the Delgados with their 3 kids and their full-time jobs, and Phil with his bad knee. I was thinking that I had a machine and the ability to use it and a couple of hours to spend, and that seemed like enough reason to do something useful. The satisfaction of driving that snow blower past Wanda's buried driveway after she complained was real, and I won't pretend otherwise. I'm human. But what I actually remember most from that morning wasn't Wanda's face or the victory of it. It was Alina Harper waving from her door and calling out, "God bless you, Doug," and Phil's string of emojis filling up my notification screen, and Maria Delgado's thumbs up through the storm door. That's the thing about HOAs when they go wrong. They convince themselves that community is about rules and standards and property values, that it can be measured in hedge heights and driveway surfaces, and the precise decibel level of a snow blower at 6 in the morning. And they lose sight of the fact that what actually makes a neighborhood a community is a lot simpler and a lot warmer than any of that. It's showing up for people. It's doing the cold, inconvenient, unremarkable work of being a neighbor. Wanda Ellsworth had lived 4 houses down from the Harpers for 11 years, and had apparently never once cleared their driveway or knocked on their door in a snowstorm. She'd been too busy measuring hedges and processing fines. Some weeks after the new board was established, Phil organized the first neighborhood spring cleanup day. People came out to rake and mulch and pull winter debris from the common areas and plant some flowers around the main entrance. It was the kind of thing Pinecrest Estates hadn't done in years because communal effort had given way to top-down enforcement. There was a potluck at the end, tables set up in the common area, everyone bringing food. George and Alina Harper came out. George used his walker, but he made it. He shook my hand and held it for a long moment and said, "Young man, you started something good." I told him I just cleared some snow. He shook his head. "You did a lot more than that," he said. "I thought about that for a while." And I think he was right, not because of anything particularly heroic about what I did, but because sometimes the right thing at the right moment creates space for a lot of other right things to follow. Wanda's complaint, her petty, entitled, frozen-toed complaint about my snow blower waking her up, was the grain of sand that started the whole avalanche. She handed me the situation, and I made a choice about what to do with it. I'd do it the same way again. Actually, I'd probably start a little later so she couldn't even try to cite me for the noise ordinance. 6:15 was cutting it close. By the following winter, the 2nd January after all of this, Pinecrest Estates had a formal volunteer snow clearing program organized through the HOA. Residents with snow blowers could sign up to be on a route that covered elderly residents and households with documented mobility issues. There were 5 of us on the list. The HOA maintained a fuel reimbursement fund for participating volunteers. It was a real, functioning, warm-hearted system. The first time the program ran was after a 6-inch snowfall in December, nothing like the monster storm that started all of this, just a normal winter snowfall. I was the first one out. I did my driveway, Phil's, the Harpers, and then continued down the list. By the time I got to number 4 on my route, Phil had started from the other end of the list and we met in the middle. It was about 7 in the morning. The sun was barely up, just a gray-pink light over the snow-covered rooftops, and the street was quiet except for the sound of the 2 machines working. It was cold, 10 degrees or so, the kind of cold that makes your breath come out in big white clouds and makes your fingers numb even through gloves. It was perfect in its own way. I thought about Wanda briefly, just for a moment, the way you might briefly think about a bad dream you had a long time ago. She'd moved out of Pinecrest Estates in September, sold her house and gone to live, according to neighborhood rumor, closer to her sister in another state. I didn't know if that was true, and I didn't particularly care. The house at 412 Clearwater Lane had been bought by a young couple in their 30s who had already introduced themselves to everyone on the block and brought cookies to the Harpers within their first week. Their driveway was on my list. I drove the machine up to their freshly buried driveway, set my footing in the snow, and got to work. Phil waved at me from across the street, his breath making clouds in the cold air. I waved back. George Harper, who I later learned had been watching from his window since 5:30 because he was an early riser and a light sleeper, and he liked to watch the snow, told me afterward that we looked like 2 guys who had figured something out. He said he couldn't explain exactly what it was we'd figured out, just that we had. I think he meant that we'd figured out what the neighborhood was actually for. Not for protecting property values, not for enforcing hedge heights, not for levying fines that disappeared into someone's personal account. It was for looking out for each other when the temperature dropped and the snow piled up and the roads iced over and the world got a little harder to navigate than usual. Which, if you think about it, is basically all the time. The snow blower runs great, by the way. I got it serviced in October. The engine is clean, the auger is sharp, it throws snow 20 feet with no problem. It is loud. I know it is loud. I started at 7 in the morning on the dot or at 8 on weekends, right on the legal side of the line, and I make no apology for the sound it makes. It's a beautiful sound, actually, once you know what it's being used for.